Okay, this is Mr. Heimberg. We're going to be going through our review for the chapter test on Friday over chapter 3. And again, you'll have to bear with me a little bit getting used to writing on my computer screen. So after a couple more of these videos, I'm sure I'll be a lot better. All right, our chapter 3 test is going to begin with knowing the locations on a map of where the different climate zones are. So you will have a circle and the equator will be marked, and the Tropic of Cancer will be there, and the Tropic of Capricorn. We'll also have the Antarctic Circle and the Arctic Circle marked. And our starting point is going to be showing where the different climate zones are based on latitudes. So you're going to need to know that tropical is above the equator and below the equator. And tropical, of course, is when you have warm weather year-round, lots of precipitation, lots of rain, and you're going to find that just above and below the equator. Next, in this section here and this section here, those are both temperate, meaning they have all 4 seasons. We live in a temperate climate. And then up at the top and the bottom, where the North Pole is and the South Pole, we of course have our polar climates. And polar down here. And that makes sense. It's a polar climate. It's by the poles, by the North Pole and the South Pole. Whether there is cold all year round, that's where we have permafrost, permanently frozen soil. So you need to know those 3. Polar is at the North and South Pole, tropical is along the equator, and temperate is in between polar and tropical, both in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. Now that leaves us with highland and dry. And on this map, what we'll do, we'll draw something that kind of looks like mountains, where we want you to show highland areas. And we'll draw something that kind of looks like a cactus. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do a good cactus. Okay, maybe put some thorns on it. Okay, so anywhere you see a cactus on the map or mountains, you'll know for cactus you're going to put dry. For mountains, that's a highland region. Up highland, we're talking about mountains. As we've talked about elevation, as you go up in elevation up a mountain, temperature decreases, and in a dry climate, you have very little precipitation. These types of climates aren't dependent on latitude, where they're at on the Earth latitude-wise. They're dependent on a number of factors, and they're found at different latitudes. That's why they don't sort of fit into this model of talking about where the climate zones are by latitude. Okay, the next section of your test is going to be a multiple choice section. Unless you're in the pre-AP class, the pre-AP class will have a short answer section at this point. Again, we in class we had our vocabulary that we worked on this week. We also had our study guide that we've been working on this week, and we'll finish up tomorrow. Well, actually on Thursday. I'm recording this Wednesday. So studying those study guides is going to help you tremendously. But some of the things that you need to know, you need to know what a weather front is. When 2 air masses collide and cause severe storms. You need to know that members of an ecosystem interact with each other. So in an ecosystem, animals and plants depend on each other. You're going to need to know the difference between weather and climate. And actually, there's a couple of places on the test that you need to know that. Remember, weather is what's happening in the short term, right now, today, tomorrow. If I say the weather outside today is 54 degrees and sunny, that's an example of weather. If I say that Northwest Indiana has hot, humid summers and cold, snowy winters, that would be an example of climate. And with climate, we're talking long term, when you average weather over a long period of time. Make sure you know the difference between renewable and non-renewable resources. Renewable, of course, can be replaced, or they're things that we don't run out of. Things like solar energy are renewable, water is renewable, trees are renewable if we take the time to replant. So those are some examples of renewable. Non-renewable of course, are things that cannot be renewed. And the big offenders there, the big things that we think about, are the fossil fuels. And when we talk about fossil fuels, we're talking coal and oil are the two biggies. Things that once we take them out of the earth, it's going to take millions and millions of years for them to be replaced. So we're basically going to be out of luck once we're done. Okay, the next section of the test is where you're going to match some examples of how climate affects our lives with situations. So, let's say, let's move over here a bit. The four ways that you're going to be thinking about are recreation. That means what we do for fun. Sorry, that R isn't very good. What people do for fun, and weather affects that, climate affects that. If you live in an area with lots of snow, you might learn to snow ski or go snowmobiling or ice fishing. If you live somewhere where it's warm all the time, like in Florida, you might be able to swim all year round or play baseball outside all year round. Clothing is another thing that is affected by the climate you live in. If you live in a cold climate, then obviously you're going to need hats and gloves and winter coats. And if you live in a warm environment, you might wear shorts and a t-shirt all year long. Okay, shelter is affected by climate. Again, if you live in the tropics, many people in the tropics live in open air houses where they have a roof and a floor, but they don't have any sides to their house or any walls, so that the breezes can come through during the day, keeping them cool. And they might have like blinds that would come down at night for privacy. But shelter is affected by the weather. If you live in a cold environment, of course, you have to have a home that's sealed up against the weather, a home that's going to hold in the heat. And the last one I haven't mentioned yet is food. Climate can affect the type of food that grows. In the tropics, you have lots of fruits that grow easily, so fruit would be a big part of their diet. It just depends where you live. Certain things grow in the United States, in the Midwest where we live. With the climate that we have, grain grows, wheat, and that can be turned into bread. So lots of people eat bread in our country and in the Midwest. So we'll give you some different scenarios, and you've got to tell which of these four things that scenario is talking about. Okay, let's see. We also need to make sure that you understand how altitude, latitude, bodies of water, and storms affect weather and climate. So we're going to give you some examples, and you've got to decide. Remember, altitude means how high you are up a mountain. And the big thing to remember with altitude is that temperature drops as you go up a mountain. The higher you go up the mountain, the lower the temperature. With latitude, that really goes back to what I started with on that map. It's warm by the equator, or warmer by the equator, and of course colder at the poles, the North and South poles. Okay. Bodies of water. We've discussed a couple of things in regards to large bodies of water. We've talked about ocean currents that carry warm water from the equator up towards the poles, and the ocean currents that carry the cold water from the poles back towards the equator. And those affect weather and climate, especially along the coasts of the continents. If a warm water current is coming up from the equator, you're going to have relatively mild weather, like on the west coast of our country. And if you have a cold current coming down the coast of a continent, you're going to have colder weather along those areas. Also remember that in the case of a big body of water like Lake Michigan, water tends to cool and warm up slower than land. And that's something we've discussed repeatedly. The idea that right now as the weather's cooling off in the fall, you could still go swimming in Lake Michigan, and when you were in the water you'd be pretty comfortable. It's just when you get out of the water that you're going to be awfully cold, because the water temperature is lower, or excuse me, it's warmer right now than the air temperature is on some days. Eventually the water temperature will catch up and get really cold by the time we get into winter. But initially, because Lake Michigan is so big and it's warm from the summer months, it's going to take a while to cool back off. And then the third thing in here, or the fourth thing we're going to discuss in here, or that you'll be responsible for knowing, is storms. And again, it goes back to, I believe I talked about it already. It goes back to the idea of a front, that when two different or air masses meet or collide, like a cold air mass and a warm air mass, or a dry air mass and a moist air mass, you're going to get severe storms. Okay. Moving on from there, we're going to give you some situations that deal with weather and climate. Let me find a spot over here to do some writing. So weather versus climate, again, that's, I guess I could use this up here. If I give you an example like, it's supposed to be cold and rainy tomorrow, you have to decide, is that an example of talking about weather or talking about climate? And since we're talking about what's happening short term tomorrow, that would be weather. If I said that Northwest Indiana has 4 distinct seasons, spring, summer, winter, and fall, I'd be talking about, or giving an example of climate, about the weather over the long term. I guess I could change this, because that should have said long term. Okay, let's see, winding down the test. There's going to be a matching section, and that just goes back to the vocab words that we worked on this week. So knowing the definitions of weather, front, equator, humid continental, ocean currents, rain shadow effect, temperate region, reforestation, and fossil fuels. So make sure you study your study guide for those, and if you missed any of those, just pause this video and replay it until you hear me say those again. And the final section, there's 40 questions on the test, but the final section is going to be true-false. Make sure that you know, again, some examples of renewable and non-renewable resources, like I covered, let's see, right over here. Make sure you know the definition of temperate. Temperate means, well, in the case of weather, a temperate climate is a climate that has 4 seasons. But temperate also means mild, not too extreme, not too hot, not too cold, kind of in the middle. Make sure you know that when we talk about soil, the topsoil is where roots get planted, where insects live. Then you have the subsoil that sits between the topsoil and the layer of rock and broken rock that's beneath. But most of the the life that goes on in soil happens in the topsoil, where roots take hold for plants and where insects live, like worms. And when things break down, organic material breaks down, like leaves and animals, as they decay and they form that humus, that's what helps to fertilize that topsoil. Okay, I think that pretty much covers it.